So I think what's really exciting for me when I look at the info David was sharing and kind of the success of June's Journey that Property was discussing is I think it's always so important for developers to just keep investing in their games, to keep building, to keep growing, and ideally be approaching that from the standpoint of what their users want, and really like the users that they have, not the imaginary users they might get in the future. Because I think that the more that we invest to understand the audience, we invest to provide users with what they look for, what they desire, that's what really enables that growth. And kind of one of these other phrases that I always tend to kind of like anchor on, I don't know if I made it up, I don't know if I heard it somewhere else, is like games only die when devs stop investing in them. And so as much as possible, if you think about the concepts David was talking about, builders versus stagnators versus the decliners and so on, just because your game might not launch as one of the green lines, that doesn't mean that you can't understand what worked, understand what didn't, understand and identify who the users you have and what do they actually need, and be able to course correct. Because as much as the insights that David was showing are really, really powerful, and they're things that you can actually leverage to guide your development, they're not a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because you don't come out of the gate really strongly doesn't mean that you're always going to lag behind. And so hopefully everything that they share has been valuable and is going to be really helpful, and you'll take it and apply to it. Apply it to your own games next time you're launching them, or you can apply it to your games that are in kind of the more expansive phases. But with that, I'm going to start on my talk and get into the last session of the games track for the day. And so I guess to get started, I think one of the things that I'm pretty sure everybody in this room knows is that mobile games are big, like really big, really, really big. And what we've seen is that mobile games have grown substantially over the past 5 years. And while many of your companies, many of your games might not be quite at the peak that they were during the middle of the pandemic, I'd imagine that most are still substantially higher than they were 5 years ago. Because the industry's gotten bigger, the pie has gotten bigger. And I want to give you a sense of just how large it has gotten. So what we're looking at here, it's comparing games performance, or the growth for games from 2018 to 2023. And what we actually see, regardless of whether we look at number 10, number 25, number 100, number 1,000, everyone has grown significantly. The 10th ranked game in January of 2023 made 48% more money than the 10th ranked game in 2018. For games ranked 25 to 40 or 249, they're 63% to 73% higher than what those equivalent ranked games were in 2018. And finally, if you look at that 1,000th ranked game, it is 115% higher than that equivalent game was 5 years ago. And so again, the ecosystem is getting bigger. Games is getting so much more established. So many users are playing it. So many people are perceiving value and paying. As I said before, like games is massive. But this growth, it's not without its challenges. Despite the fact that the pie is getting bigger and bigger, what we're seeing is that there's new challenges because the top charts, they're really beginning to calcify. Each and every year, almost regardless of which market you look at, we're seeing progressive declines in the number of new titles that are entering into the top 100. We have all of these legacy, strong, successful games with veteran teams, June's Journey being an example, where the developer teams are continuing to invest to give players what they need to sustain their own growth. And of course, that creates challenges for everybody who's trying to launch new games and get in. Because we have this weird duality. The pie's getting bigger, everybody's making so much more money, but that top 100, that's a big thing in people's minds. And so how do we think about figuring out what are the vectors of the areas to grow when we're looking at bigger pie, more calcified top charts? So to give you an example of kind of what this calcification looks like, I want to talk through 3 major markets in the world. So South Korea, you see here, it has historically been the most volatile country from a top charts perspective, with the highest % of annual turnover year over year. And while it doesn't look like a small drop here, minus 13%, Between that 5-year period, South Korea, again, which is the market with the most turnover, went from seeing 53 new entrants into the top charts between 2017 and 2018 to only 46 in 2021 to 2022. The US is on the opposite end of the spectrum. In almost every year over the past 5, the US market has actually seen the least amount of turnover in terms of games. And so even with relatively few new games entering into it, it's down 52%. It is even that much harder to have a new game, enter into the top 100 in any given year. Turkey is also a valuable one to look at because it's a top emerging market. And what you can see is that over a 5-year period, it has gone from having 65 games, a really significant number of new entrants between 2017 to 2018, to having 35 new entrants in the current or last year. 54% reduction. So it's almost like, regardless of whether it's an East or West, regardless of whether it's an established versus a more emerging country, all of these things are calcifying. And so what I want to talk about now is at least my mental framework for how I think we might go about identifying opportunities and figuring out what to focus on. And in my particular case, I like to categorize opportunities based on the risks or the uncertainties associated with them. And so you'll see 3 words: proven, probable, potential. The way that I would like to define these is, in my mind, proven represents an opportunity that you have near at hand that you can invest in with relatively little effort and where you're likely to see returns within a short period of time. Probable is a case where you have to invest some moderate number of resources, you might see returns in the medium term, and you have a mid to high confidence of being able to achieve that. And then potential, that's a bit more of the out there. Some ways that's a bit more of the moonshot, but it's the opportunities which, if done successfully, when executed in the right way, can really pay massive dividends and returns. And so in terms of how I want to apply these, I want to take a look at proven opportunities from the standpoint of users, those that you have and those that you could readily obtain. For probable, I want to take a look at countries, both from the standpoint of the countries that you might be in, but also the countries that maybe you should be in because that's where your competitors are operating. And then finally, from the potential perspective, I want to talk about the devices that we're on and the devices that we should be on. And so, moving over to proven, let's think about the users that we have and the users that we could potentially obtain. Now, one thing is a little bit of a level set before I get into this particular section. Unless otherwise noted, all data in this section is focused just on the US market. Now, the trends I'm going to be talking about, they're exhibited in many other markets out there. It's just a little bit simpler narrative. For this one, we just focus on the US. And so with that out of the way, here's a question for you. Who are the most valuable gamers? Is it males or is it females? And the answer, it depends. It kind of depends on really like what are you trying to optimize for and what are you trying to achieve? Because if we take a look at performance or value from an ARPU perspective, average revenue per paying user, what we see is, yes, males are more valuable on an ARPU basis. When males spend, they spend more than females. True in the US, true in most other countries. But what we can also see is that the gap, the relative difference between males and females is steadily declining over time. In 2018, female ARPU lagged males by 33%. In Q2 of this year, that gap was only 20%. So in a 5-year span, you actually saw a 50% reduction in the delta between male and female spend. And so does this make males more valuable? Maybe. Again, it depends on what you're trying to look at. Because if we take a look at it from an ARPDAU basis, non-deduped ARPDAU, what we actually see is a completely different pattern. In 2018, female ARPDAU lagged males by 17%. In Q2 of this year, in the US, female ARPDAU on a non-deduped basis exceeded males by 25%. And this is, of course, a combination of the female ARPDAUs growing, the males declining, but there's also some interesting factors that play into this. Because we're talking about non-deduped ARPDAU, we're looking at the function of not the unique humans, but the human and then the number of games that they play. And what we've observed when we looked at the data is male and female gameplay patterns in the US, largely driven by the number of games that they're playing simultaneously, they've changed. So if you take a look at the graph, what you see is from Q1 18 up until just a little bit before the pandemic, males and females, their non-dedupe kind of DAU was growing pretty much in lockstep. But then once the pandemic started, they fundamentally changed, or they completely diverged from that lockstep pattern. And what we've been able to observe is during the pandemic, males just started playing a lot more games. Like seriously, like guys started playing a lot more games simultaneously. It was really kind of surprising when I saw this because I actually thought it was a data error, but it wasn't, it's not, it's real. But that's kind of where my mind goes. And so one of the things we've been able to identify is that while females have started playing more games, they're still of an upslope. They're remaining substantially more loyal and consistent at playing a smaller number of core games. Not core as a genre, but just core to them. And so you might be asking, like, why is this important? Why should we focus on this? I want to share one other stat just so you can understand like why it's really, really critical to think about males versus females differently, but especially to think about advantages to focusing and tailoring your games a bit more towards females. So if you take a look at that chart, what it shows is the median female DAU for games based on their rank in the US top charts, and it's in Q2 of this year. And what we see is that higher ranked games are overweight or even weight towards females. Games ranked 1 through 10 in the US, the median female DAU is 55%. For games ranked 11 through 25, that median female DAU is 50%. But if you look, as you go further and further down, it really kind of drops like a rock. The further you go down the top charts, fewer females are playing that game. And so what I really ask you to consider is, like, what's the gender split in your game look like? And if you're overweight towards males, is that an intentional design choice, or is that a little bit of an accidental byproduct of decisions that you've made? Because it's important to be intentional here. And so now what I want to switch over is take a look at some of the signals that can help you maybe guide how you invest to better serve and or monetize males and females. And hoping that you guys can take this, what I'm going to talk about, as an option to just better differentiate your offerings. And so when we take a look at females and what seems to resonate with them, what we find is that females, female buyers as a percent of daily buyers is 57% higher than males. So when females are purchasing, they're purchasing more regularly and more consistently. And what I'd really like you to think about doing is treating your females like loyalists. Because what we've already seen is females are playing fewer games, they're engaging in them more, and they're purchasing at higher rates than males. And so given this, I think you have meaningful opportunities to really begin segmenting your female users, understanding what it is that they value, what are they finding rewarding, and then really invest to give them more of that. Give them more of the features, the sales, the items, the events that they value. Because they're loyalists, treat them like that. That's going to kind of build a virtuous circle where they're more engaged, and so they spend more, which gives you more opportunity to support them. Males, on the other hand, males are proven to be much more like tourists, like dabblers, because if we take a look at the first time, on any given day, the first-time buyer percentage of total buyers, what we see is that for males, it is 52% higher. This is a bit of a hyperbolic statement, but the way that I'm kind of thinking of this, or kind of internalized it, it's a bit like guys will buy anything once. And so they're hopping into games, they're checking it out, they're making a purchase, maybe they're making a second one, and then they're bouncing and going on to something else. And so from your standpoint of how to best monetize and how best to engage them, knowing that they're dipping their toe into the water of every single game that comes across, I really want you to focus on figuring out, like, what is the most meaningful offer that you can provide them when they first get into the game, and how do you make sure that they perceive that as highly valuable, highly relevant, and then make sure that you actually have a secondary offer to follow up, which is also equally valuable. Because the patterns that I'm seeing where guys are playing substantially more games simultaneously, it might be hard to convert them to treat your game as their primary game, but I think there's really good opportunities to get them to think of your game as their secondary game or as their tertiary game. So you're not going to maybe turn them all into high-value users, but if you can get $5 here, $7 there, that adds up very, very quickly. And so I really do think that there's opportunities for all of y'all to leverage these differences in male versus female monetization to help kind of drive growth in your game. And I'd personally like to hypothesize that adapting to females purchasing more regularly, thinking about males as tourists, and amplifying the offers you give them initially, that's going to actually pay dividends on both sides. It's actually going to benefit all of your users. And this is really important to enable you to capture growth, because there's like a lot of growth to capture. Now, if we kind of zoom out to a global view, what we're looking at is females really represent a tremendous opportunity in games. When we look at Play's top markets over the last 5 years, what we see is that 8 of these markets saw their female ARPDAU at least double. And when comparing male versus female non-deduped ARPDAU, over 80% of these markets actually female ARPDAU grew faster during that time period. Excuse me. And in many markets, like, it's not that it grew a little bit faster, it grew a lot faster. Brazil, France, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Netherlands, Poland, Thailand. Each of these markets, female ARPDAU grew at least twice as fast as males during this period. And so, like, there's a real opportunity here. It's yours for the taking, and so I'd really encourage you to think about how you can leverage male versus female monetization differences to capture growth in the short term. Now, the one last thought that I want to kind of share here and get you all to think about is, if you think about the gender distribution in your game, how does that compare to the gender distribution of your dev teams? I started my career in like AAA HD gaming. We were like 90% guys. How many of y'all's studios are still a bunch of guys making games for guys? It's kind of always bugged me because, I mean, sure, yes, the industry is a bunch of white dudes making games for white dudes, or that was the meme years ago. I think we need to move beyond that. I think we need to align our dev teams with our users so that we can actually give them more and enable more meaningful growth in the ecosystem. And again, kind of like a downer thought to say, yeah, we're really male-centric, we kind of suck, and so that. But I really put that out as a challenge for all of y'all, because I do think that in order to capture the growth that we're seeing here, we need to evolve, and we need to adapt our teams to be more aligned with the users that we're trying to attract. So with kind of that as the last thought in the first section, I want to move on from proven, and I want to talk about probable. And specifically, I want to focus on the countries that you're in, as well as give a sense of which countries maybe you're not in, but you should be, because that's where the competitors are, or that's where the opportunities lie. And so as a framing thought for this section, what I'd like you to do is think about, for your biggest game, what is the top market for you all by spend? And if you happen to think of that market, how much spend does it actually contribute? And so now that you have that thought in your head, here's what market concentration looks like for the top games on Play. And so these are percentiles, and what we're seeing is that the median top game on Play gets 47% of its revenue from a single country. Like, that's a lot. There is no market in the world that is anywhere near that big. That's like really, really concentrated. And to give you a sense, the largest market in Play in terms of overall revenue, it's smaller than that 10th percentile. And so what we're seeing in the industry is that top games are really concentrated relative to what they could be if they were tapping the full potential of Android Play in the world. And I want to give you now, guys, a sense now of like why this is important. If you take a look at the chart, what it's showing is that the top games on Play are less reliant on any single country for their revenue. And that the further that you go down the top charts, the more reliant countries become, or games become in a single country's revenue. And the important kind of concept or takeaway here is that rank and reliance are inversely correlated. Now, I want to give you a sense of why that's so important. And so let me talk you through this chart because there's a little bit going on here. So the x-axis, this is looking at the countries that a game is in, ordered from the country that contributes the most revenue to the least revenue. And then the y-axis is showing the percentage growth in revenue with each successive country. So if you take a look at the blue line, which is games ranked 1 through 10 globally, what we see is that by the time they get to their 8th market, they have already doubled their revenue. For the red line, which is games ranked 11 through 25 globally, it takes them 25 markets in order to double. And then for the blue, the green, the yellow, the orange, they never actually get there because they're just so focused, so reliant on one single country. And I do want to say, if one of your games maps more to the blue or to the green, the orange, or the yellow, it's not that you're doing anything wrong. And I want to emphasize it. Not that you're doing anything wrong. It's more of a case that the opportunity out there is so much bigger than you actually might realize. And that opportunity, it's huge. Because you know how I said the top 10 games double by the time they get to the 8th country? They're still even concentrated relative to Play's overall distribution. That those top 10 games, if their distribution of countries matched Play's revenue distribution by countries, there's 47% upside. 47% for the top 10 games in the world. I mean, that's absolutely massive. And it's just something to think about how much potential there is to optimize your game and expand internationally. And so if you want to capture that growth, what are the ways to get started? Let's say you're actually new to this. If you're new to this space, if you're new to thinking about markets more seriously, I think the key thing to remember is be really intentional about which markets you invest in. There's been so many devs that I have talked to over the years that get really, really excited. They want to go to country X, they want to go to country Y, they want to go to country Z. When you start to probe, it's well, why those? Well, I read something or I heard something. But they didn't do the research. They didn't do the due diligence. They didn't figure out whether the fit is actually right. And so for those of y'all, when you're thinking about expanding to new markets, really, really encourage you to spend time to identify which markets are the right fit for your game, which markets are going to have the right synergies. And once you've done that, then invest to localize, ideally culturalize, but at minimum localize your games. And once you have that, then start spending in limited amounts, but go out and start actually acquiring users. Pay attention to the ROAS for that spend. Pay attention to the KPIs. But iteratively learn through your investments as you're approaching those markets. So let's say that you've already started to do that. You've built up a substantial user base in the markets. What next? Well, I think a few key things to focus on for that next level of international investment. Well, the first is going to be expand the range of devices that you support. There's a lot of upside there, and I've got a slide, probably 5, 6 slides up, that's going to give you a sense of just how much opportunity there is for supporting lower-end devices. I think the other big one is optimizing pricing. You heard it mentioned this morning. You just heard a long talk from Robbie and Daniel about that, but tremendous opportunities as part of international expansion to optimize your pricing. And I think the last one to focus on is really begin to actually customize that gameplay, customize your events. Seen big successes from a lot of developers when they're invested in certain markets and they just start running local live ops. These don't even need to be super custom and bespoke. It's just being aware of what are the holidays, what are the cultural calendars, what's the relevance in those particular markets, and how can you just align your live ops to the cultural moments of the users that you're trying to appeal to. And so let's say you've done all of that and you're really looking to go kind of the final steps. It's really all about building systems that give you full flexibility and control and therefore enable you to have highly tailored approaches. And so for me, kind of the first one on that, because that's what unlocks that full degree of control, It's segmented servers. Whether it's segmented by continent, by subregion, by country, as soon as you can get down to that point, assuming the player liquidity in your game allows it, you start to begin to have full control. Another big one that I've seen a lot of developers have success with is spinning up local operations teams. But it's not just spinning up the team, it's actually spinning up the team and giving them the agency and empowering them to make decisions in terms of sales and events and customization and everything. Because if you do both of those, you're really at the point where kind of any amount of bespoke optimization you would want to achieve, or you would want, is achievable. And it's not saying that you have to do this, just do like those first 2 slides, that's enough to capture significant growth. But some of the biggest countries or companies in the world I've seen do all of this, and the results are outstanding, like really, really outstanding. And so a few slides ago, I said it's really important to be intentional about picking the markets that you invest in. And what I want to do now is give you a couple slides worth of insights which show the markets that are most relevant to the top categories. And so the numbers that you see associated with each of these categories, this represents the number of countries top games in that category need to invest in order to get to 90% coverage. And what you can see, it's a really wide spread there. RPG has 10 markets, Action has 32, and I think that spread, it really ends up being correlated with kind of the monetization mechanics that these categories and the genres in them have. So if you think about RPG, generally speaking, it is a pretty expensive genre. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, takes a lot of investment to be successful. So you get really high ARPDAUs, extremely high ARPUs. Action, on the other hand, that's where you're going to find a lot of the competitive shooters, the MOBAs. Those games just like polar opposite from RPGs, because the competitive shooters, the battleground games, users are getting effectively a full-featured, complete, free game that they can play for free and don't really have to pay. But those games make astronomical amounts of money because they appeal to so many people. And so if you think about all of these, it starts to inform or suggest which countries are you likely to see. And so if we take a look at this, and I realize there's a lot of flags on this side, and I'm not going to talk through all of them, so encourage y'all to snap a pic so that you can kind of like take it offline, digest with your team. I do have 2 high-level takeaways that I want to make. The first is which of the markets appear most frequently on here. And so you have US, Canada, Germany, France, UK, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Those markets appear in every single one of these categories. So at a minimum, from an international expansion standpoint, those are the 8 that you want to focus on. The other kind of high-level takeaway I want to say or mention is if you look more towards the left of the slide, and you start to like squint at the countries that are there, they really have kind of a G7 vibe going on. But then as you go further to the right, you get to many more developing, many more emerging markets. And that's kind of just an important distinction based on what I was just mentioning about high monetization, high ARPU RPGs versus lower monetization, more distributed, larger user base action games. It's an important thing to remember in terms of almost like the value that Play brings, the value that Android brings. I can't remember who actually said this, but I always like the phrase. It's like, Play and Android really give you the world. They are ubiquitous. They are in every country. It is really the opportunity for you to tap in all of the users that are out there. And so I'd encourage you to think about that as you kind of invest to identify which markets are going to best fit for your games. And so now, as kind of we enter the home stretch, I want us to think about potential growth opportunities. And I'm going to look at this from the devices standpoint. Admittedly, this session is going to be a bit fractal. As the 3 slides I have in it, I'm going to focus first on a proven, then on a probable, then on a potential. And so from the standpoint of proven, really want y'all, if you're not already doing this, to think about expanding the device range so that you're optimizing and enable users to play on all Android phones. The lift from this can be appreciable. If you look at just kind of like top markets, and they're listed down at the bottom, so like US, Japan, Germany, et cetera. A developer only focused on new high-end devices. If they suddenly then went to supporting all Android devices, they could increase their revenue by 100%. For the rest of the world, that same kind of comparison, the lift would be 312%. And so there's just such substantial opportunities with Android to try to ensure that all users, regardless of their device, can play your games. The probable opportunity that I want to mention is tied to like large screen devices, tablets, foldables, et cetera. Based on the data that we have at play, what we see is that users who engage on both phones and tablets, or phones and other large screens, versus phone-only users, the ones who engage on these tablets and their large screen, we see the monthly spend from them as much as 8 times higher than those phone-only users. Now, admittedly, some of this is going to be tied to affluence because multiple devices, they cost more and so on. But there's also a massive amount of just gameplay enhancement by virtue of offering your product on a larger screen. We do see that users who engage on larger screens also, in addition to monetization, have better retention and better engagement metrics. Now, the last one, this is potential, this is speculative. The last one that we see is just the opportunity associated with going multi-platform. If we take a look at the Google Play games on PC data, and we compare the spend of those users to users who engage and play and spend only on the phone, what we see is users who also engage on Google Play games on PC, their spend can be 11x higher than phone-only users. Lots of upside there, lots of upside. And so I think the thing for me here, it's not to say, go out and get your game on PC. It's more, spend some titles with the brain trust that you have at your company to identify what, if any, multi-platform strategy is right for your company, given your skills, given your interest, et cetera. Because I think there are benefits right now to being deliberate about what is the strategy you want to employ over the next 5 years, or make a deliberate decision that this is not a space we want to play in. And so to close out, you kind of just heard me talk about what are the proven, what are the probable, what are the potential opportunities. And to just kind of summarize it, for proven, focus on females. Because what we see is that in the US, the top-ranked games, or the better way of putting it, the higher you are in the ranks, the more likely you are to have a greater share of female players in your game. And so really focus on developing solutions and developing strategies that better cater to and give female players more of what they need and desire and value. That's the short-term thing. The longer-term one, let's figure out how do we evolve and grow the industry beyond being a bunch of dudes making games for dudes. From the standpoint of the probable opportunity, this is that international expansion. And as we saw, higher-ranked games are less reliant on a single country for their growth. And so I'd really encourage you to figure out which markets could or should you be investing in, and what degree of investments do you want to make to capture the potential that they represent. And then finally, on the devices side, the more you can invest to expand the available devices in your game, the greater your addressable, your potential audience is going to be. It's significant for phones, substantial spend increases for tablets, potentially the risky massive upside for multi-platform. And just on that multi-platform, ask you all to be deliberate about it. Be conscious. But there's just so many opportunities out there that I hope you guys are successful pursuing all of them. And so that's it for this. Thank you guys very much for listening to me.